Good morning. Good morning. So welcome everyone. I'm Dr. Fanny Loby from the Department of Political Science, and I want to welcome you to the 6th annual multidisciplinary conference sponsored by the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at William Paterson University. So this is an event that we host every year, and it's an interdisciplinary event which allows us to bring the perspectives from multiple disciplines on a single focus or a single event. So this year, the event, as you can see, is the concept for the conference is truth and different conceptions of truth. So I want to begin by acknowledging the co-sponsorship and the generous support from the university's Alumni Association's Distinguished Visiting Professorship, the Office of Sophomore and Junior Experience, and the Office of Employment, Equity, and Diversity. So at this point, I have to ask you to please silence your cell phones and kind of ask you to not take any videos or photographs of the event. We are taping the event, and the video will be available very soon on the university's website. But throughout the conference, you can tweet your questions or your comments about the presentations using the hashtag BYO Truth. So we do encourage you to participate in that way. So the title that we chose for the conference is BYO Truth, and we wanted to encourage conversations about what truth is and how we know it. And today is really a context where even though we tend to think of truth as this universal concept, truth has become increasingly this individual concept, this more individualized concept. So you've all heard debates about facts and truth and fake news and alternative facts. And some of these conversations that you've seen or you've participated in have taken place online. And so all of these new internet platforms have created ways to disseminate information, but also misinformation, to the point that many of us no longer feel like we know what sources we can trust. So public universities like William Paterson Universities have long presented themselves as places where the search for truth, or at least for a fact-based explanation for specific phenomena, is taking place. And many of us in the college and at the university will explore economic, sociological, historical, and political problems using a scientific method that is supposed to provide some guarantee of accuracy of our results. However, public universities are now being challenged as places where this objective research occurs. And recently, something was brought to my attention. It was a poll done by the Pew Research Center that showed there was a very large partisan gap in public trust in colleges and universities. And so the number was that 58% of Republican respondents were saying that colleges and universities have a negative effect on how things are going in the country, right? So 58% said that colleges and universities had a negative effect, and it was only 37% for banks and financial institutions, which I thought was, pretty interesting comparison. So why do we have this lack of trust? Why do people prefer to trust a Facebook post rather than something that's written in the New York Times? And so in my discipline of political science, we try to show students the role of leaders in shaping public opinion. And only a couple of weeks ago, we had a great example of this, because the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, when addressing issues of gerrymandering and when presented with evidence from a scientific study, described this study using the terms, and I quote, sociological gobbledygook. I had to look up that word because I didn't know what it meant, right? But basically it means, it's nothing, right? Or it's just talk. So these types of interventions send very powerful messages about the value of fact-based research, but also about the individuals who engage in it. So this conference is here to address issues of language and truth and seeks to make sense of the fog of the debates that we've encountered. So for now, it's my pleasure to invite the Dean of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, Kara Rabbit, Dr. Kara Rabbit, to welcome everyone to this conference. Dean Rabbit.
Good morning. Thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to look out and see your faces. I know many of you came with faculty, and I hope that you leave with knowledge you weren't expecting and some insights and opportunities to reflect. It is truly my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. As Dr. Loby mentioned, this is our 6th annual multidisciplinary conference. And this event was designed to allow us to engage collectively and diversely some of the timely issues of our day and to show how the different disciplines engage these questions. We have explored in previous conferences such topics as access to public higher education, the social impact of our digital age, politics and anger, how we understand difference, policing, other topics. This year's conference committee has been working since last fall on envisioning and organizing today's multiple events. So before I go any further, I do want to invite you to please join me in thanking the Associate Dean of the College, Dr. Martina Davis, the conference co-chairs, Dr. Fanny Loby of Political Science, and Dr. Jason Ambrose of History, and the committee members, who include Marquita Smith of English, I'm looking around the room, Judith Bernstein of Languages and Cultures, Sumi Raghavan, and I'm sorry I just butchered your last name, of Psychology, Jennifer First of Sociology, and Megan Devlin in the Dean's Office. Thank you for all of your many, many efforts. The College of Humanities and Social Sciences is a very large and very diverse and complex unit. And what our varied disciplines share is a commitment to critical and fruitful study of the contexts of our lives. According to the college mission, our programs are designed to provide insight into the past, critically examine contemporary issues, and explore answers for the future while promoting the value of diversity. Our goal is to prepare students with the research, communication, and analytical skills that we know you will need for the rest of your lives in the form of advanced study, careers, responsible citizenship, general fruitful engagement with the world that you live in. Each of these elements of a rich and fulfilled life requires at some level a commitment to ethics, a commitment to equity, and a commitment to truth. Currently, our shared understandings of collective histories, the accepted data needed to reach decisions are under fire from various directions. And as Dr. Loby spoke to in her opening remarks, the challenges that we face from climate change to economic shifts to addressing the evolving needs for healthcare and education for a diverse population and an aging population, these require that we agree upon facts, if not always their meaning. As a literary scholar, again, we come from diverse disciplines. As a literary scholar, I have long believed in the power of story to tell truth. I know that fiction can reveal fact, in a sense, but language really matters, and misinformation is different than the functional structure of storytelling. Misinformation is deliberate refabrication of fact designed to mislead and to cover up. And so our jobs as engaged citizens is to learn how to understand truth, how to question, when to triangulate sources of knowledge, and how to come to understanding of meaning. These questions have been central to our democracy since this country's inceptions. They feel current now, but if you look back historically, we have long histories of engagement with the question of truth in this country. So I look forward to learning with you today different ways to engage these key questions for our current context, and I thank you very much for joining us. Thank you.
So our first panel, okay, sorry about this. Our first panel today, is this coming from me? Oh, okay. Sorry. Am I doing this? Our first panel will address the use of language in the diffusion of misinformation, and we'll delve into the phenomenon of science denial. We're very lucky to have our two speakers here this morning. Dr. Ana Celia Zentella is Professor Emeritus in Ethnic Studies at the University of California, San Diego. She's one of the leaders in the field of anthropolitical linguistics. Very recently, in 2015, the Latino Studies section of the Latin American Studies Association honored Dr. Zentella as Public Intellectual of the Year. And in 2016, she received the award for Public Outreach and Community Service from the Society for Linguistic Anthropology. Dr. Gorman, our second speaker, is a public health and behavioral science expert. She's written extensively about global health, science communication, psychology, and mental health. Her first book, Denying to the Grave: Why We Ignore the Facts That Will Save Us, explores the psychology behind irrational health beliefs and decision. Dr. Gorman is also co-founder of Critica, a community committed to making rational decisions about health and security. So after the presentations, the floor will be open for questions. You can also tweet your questions using the hashtag BYO Truth. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Zentella and Dr. Gorman.
How do I? Okay. I don't know. Buenos días. ¿Cómo están? I'm Ana Celia Zentella, and I come to talk to you about trumped-up information about Latinos and our languages. It's particularly important to me because as the daughter of a Mexican father and a Puerto Rican mother, I represent 75% of the Latinos in the United States. I'm often known as a Mexi-Rican or a Puerto Mex, although I prefer Chica Rica. And it's also true that my real interest is that I'm really a New Yorican. And the importance of this data that I'm going to present to you has to do with the fact that Latinos are now 18% of the United States population, and that beginning in the 1980s, Latinos and Asians became the largest group of immigrants to the United States, and it's at that time when we saw rising racist vitriol akin to what the Italians and the Jews saw at the beginning of the 20th century. A lot of comments about us breeding like rats, of being lowlifes, demanding scumbags, and Trump's claim that Mexicans were bringing drugs, crime, and were rapists are part of almost everyday newscasts and personal conversations. I want to stress one point that if I were teaching this as a class would be on the final exam, and it is about how race has been remapped from biology onto language. It's no longer cool in the post-civil rights era to speak directly about people's big lips or nappy heads or chinky eyes. Those things can get you to lose your job if the microphone is turned on when you're saying them. And it is, however, much more acceptable to make negative comments about people's accents, about how they're not learning English, about how they're unintelligible. What has happened is that the construct of race has been remapped onto language. It's very useful remapping because both race and languages are viewed as having superior and inferior qualities. There are better languages, superior languages, inferior languages, superior dialects, inferior dialects. There are supposedly better races and inferior races. And you're not supposed to mix either languages or races. How many know when it was illegal, until what year it was illegal in more than 20 states in the United States for a white person to marry a black person? Did you see the movie? Okay, the movie Loving is about that Supreme Court decision, and it was 1965 when it was still illegal to mix races via marriage. And certainly people have comments about Spanglish and Chinglish and Japlish and mixing languages. So the notion of mixing and of contamination disparages races and languages. And when you make comments about languages, you're talking in indirect ways about people's races. And you are making sure that, and you're asking people to control these groups and these ways of speaking. A senator who was a candidate for the presidency of the United States said that Spanish was the language of the ghetto when he was campaigning against bilingual education, Newt Gingrich, in the 2007 primaries. There are many signs across the United States asking people to speak English only, and some of them don't even know how to spell too well, or are asking English to be the official language of the United States. So language has become a badge of American identity, and fluency is a prerequisite, but fluency in a particular variety of English. Certainly, Trump told Bush in a debate, this is a country where we speak English, not Spanish. And just recently, 3 days ago, in Cliffside Park, New Jersey, a high school teacher told their students that soldiers were fighting for their right to speak American, not to speak Spanish. This to a group of students who were heavily Hispanic student population, and 3 of them walked out. And one of them yelled at the teacher, this is of course on one of the students' phones, one of the students yelled, you're a racist, I also speak English. So this is a fact, you can look this up, the teacher actually being videoed saying that they're supposed to speak American only and not English and not Spanish. English-only propaganda has become virulent from the part of the president, from this phone that's the woman holding the phone. That's a video where she is singing a song saying, press 1 for English. She doesn't want any she doesn't want any other languages to be allowed on the phone when she's making calls. And it has iconic pictures of the flag, which represents being a good American, of English, the English language only being part of a prerequisite, and whiteness and blondes as iconic also of the American ideal. The U.S. Army poster from World War II was converted by Oklahoma in their vote for making English its official language, the last state to become an official English language state, was they changed Uncle Sam's finger from saying, I want you for the U.S. Army, to this finger was not made for pressing 1 for English. 28 states now have official English laws, and there is an English Language Unity Act in committee in the U.S. Congress that would, in addition to the state laws that have already been passed, make English the only official language of the United States. At this point, of course, English is the language of the government of the United States, but it is not the only official language. If this English Language Unity Act passes, it would outlaw the use of languages other than English in most governmental activities. The fact of the matter is that English is not in jeopardy, and this is one of the facts that must counter this misinformation about Latinos in the United States. In fact, in the United States, less than 10% do not speak English very well in the entire country. There are 80% of the population speaks only English at home. And the 21% that speaks a language other than English, many at home, also many of them speak English very well. But the media reports that people are abandoning English. That 20% that speaks a language other than English at home is portrayed as having abandoned English, when all of those children are studying in English in US schools, and the parents are working and living in communities where they are also speaking English. The fact is, particularly among Hispanics, English proficiency is on the rise, and already in all Hispanics, some 70%, 68% speak either only English or speak English very well. Many of you who know Latino communities and families know that some of the children are not speaking Spanish already, and that Spanish is being lost in generations where the children cannot speak to their grandparents. So in fact, Spanish is being lost in the United States in the younger generations. This all has to do with our own complicit acceptance of misinformation and propagation of misinformation. As Bourdieu points out, it's not only the elite and the powerful who are promoting this. We are complicit because the language of authority never governs without the collaboration of those it governs. And this is based on misrecognition, or misinformation, which is the basis of all authority. In my own work as an anthropolitical linguist, I speak about the chiquitification of Latino languages and abilities, the putting down of our knowledge of different varieties of English, the putting down of the kind of Spanish we speak as not being from Spain or not being authentic, putting down our bilingual skills and the bashing of Spanglish, which in fact is linguistic dexterity, showing that we can juggle two languages at appropriate grammatical points. What this has led to across the United States is many examples of people using language, governmental and educational and political, and judges, people in different positions of power, using language as a proxy for race and using language as a way of categorizing people as inferior and unfit. The judge, the sheriff who became famous for his profiling in Arizona, Arpaio, and was condemned by the courts, was pardoned recently by Trump, Judge Arpaio. The people, in Massachusetts, there was an instance where the 911 operator refused calls in Spanish. In Arizona, teachers with an accent who have passed English exams and have been teaching in English for years were taken out of the classroom because of their accent. In Mississippi, in Nebraska, and in Texas, parents who were in custody battles but who were speaking Spanish to their children were told by the judge that they were unfit parents or raising children to be maids. And the increasing number of arguments and legal cases of people being told to not speak Spanish on the job, even if they're speaking at Walmart, for example, with a co-worker and being fired for speaking during lunch hour, or being fired for being heard speaking outside the factory, those cases of English on the job increased by 500% in a 10-year period from 1990 to 2000. More serious, in fact, is the fact that hate crimes and violence against Latinos and more recently against Muslims has been increasing dramatically. A 67% increase in 1 year in 2010. In 2015, a 15% increase in hate crimes and anti-Muslim crimes in particular. There was a punk group that produced a record called Speak English or Die, and that has as its chorus, "You always make us wait. You're the ones we hate. You can't communicate. Speak English or die." Now, this may be just their attempt to be ironic, as their claim was, but in fact, many people are taking it as a call to arms to rise up against any time they hear a language other than English and to attack people physically. The bus driver who poured a glass of water on an 8th grader, the students assaulted on a train for speaking Mandarin, suspended a student for speaking a Native American language, kicked off a flight for speaking Arabic, and recently the Minnesota woman who was brutally assaulted at an Applebee's for speaking in Swahili. We must interrupt the reproduction of linguistic and educational inequality and fight against hate, fight against linguistic repression, which is really a cover for racial hatred. An anthropolitical linguistic perspective says that there is no ideal dialect or language, that people who are bilinguals should not have to be speaking as if they were the border patrol, patrolling between the boundaries between their languages and never mixing them. We have to challenge the symbolic domination as the only language of the United States, although it certainly is the common lingua franca, and we want all children to learn it, but we don't think they have to do it at the expense of their home language. And we reject all ideologies of processes and that structure inequalities by insisting that there is only one type of identity that is exclusive and singular. In order to take concrete action, I'm asking for your help today to return Spanish to the portal on the whitehouse.gov website. During the Obama presidency, the slide on the left shows you that there was a Spanish version of whitehouse.gov, and that on the right, since on the day of the inauguration, in the middle of the inauguration, the White House portal eliminated all Spanish on the whitehouse.gov website. You now cannot no longer get information from the whitehouse.gov website in Spanish. The advisor, Stephen Miller, who is the architect of this and also of the Muslim travel ban, is the person who, in his high school in California, complained to administrators about announcements in Spanish and said that they were a crutch and that we were any acquiescence to people's other languages was against the ideal of American accomplishment. This pre and post-Trump, the whitehouse.gov used to have 20 or more different kinds of sections of information, and it was in English and in Spanish. At the bottom now you find this line, sorry, no results found for en español. I'm asking you to help by signing this petition, which will be available for you at the registration desk during the break. It's written both in English and in Spanish, and it's asking for a reinstatement of the Spanish links on whitehouse.gov to confirm the avowed goal that to make America great, in fact, includes the entire nation. We're interested in these issues because we believe that, in fact, the soldiers are not fighting only for people to speak in English, but for the cultural and linguistic and racial diversity of the United States to be not to be attacked. As the e pluribus unum on the money says, we are of many one, and that communication is a way of letting us know that our way of thinking is not the only way that exists in the world. Every time you hear somebody else speak another language, they're letting you know that there are other ways of thinking about the world, and we need to be open to those other ways. This morning at the breakfast in the hotel, I looked at the waiters and spoke to him, started to speak to him in Spanish, and then I said, no, wait a minute. I said, how do you say thank you in your language? And he said to me, salam apan, and that is gracias in Tagalog. Salam apan. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm Sara Gorman, as you heard a bit about me at the beginning, and I'm going to talk about science denial in a post-truth world. So you heard a little bit of my bio. I just wanted to give you a few other details. My book, Denying to the Grave, Why We Ignore the Facts That Will Save Us, came out last year in September, and it looks at some of the psychology behind why people don't believe scientific fact, particularly around health and medicine, and also about why people in the healthcare industry, including healthcare providers, make non-evidence-based decisions, like overprescribing antibiotics and the like. And it really talks about some of the psychology as well as some of the social factors that cause these issues. And after the book came out, you can imagine the timing and the election in November and then the subsequent coining of the phrase alternative facts. A lot of people started to ask me what I was going to do about some of the issues that I talked about in my book. And so I co-founded with my co-author, Jack Gorman, who's also my father, by the way. We co-founded this organization, Critica, whose mission is to develop and test new methods of increasing public trust in science and medicine and healthcare, and also improving scientific literacy. And also, we try to help people like healthcare providers be able to provide more evidence-based care. And a lot of what we do are things like trainings of professional associations of healthcare providers and consulting with organizations that face some of these issues. And so my background is public health. I'm a public health specialist, and I have expertise in behavioral science and behavior change. So when we think about modern challenges to science, I really think that this comic here sums it up better than anything I could say. It says, I found 1,837 websites about alternative medicine, but none of them recommend pizza or chocolate for lowering our cholesterol. Now, obviously, this is funny. Part of the reason it's funny is because it's true. To a certain extent, we can all relate to this. And I'm not trying to say that some of the issues we see in science and medicine, some of the beliefs like vaccines cause autism or climate change is not real, and some of the denial of scientific truths, I'm not trying to blame all of that on the internet. What I am trying to talk to you a bit about today is about motivated reasoning. In this comic, there's a motivation. This person wants to be able to eat pizza and chocolate, and so they go out there and they find the information that can then confirm whatever they want to do. And it's become easier and easier for various reasons these days to do that, and that is sort of at the heart of what some of the challenges, modern challenges to science, medicine, and public health are. So when we think a bit about how does this motivated reasoning get spurred on? One of the things that we all face every day is conflicting information. And there's a lot of conflicting information in the science and healthcare world. And one of the big areas where there's a lot of conflicting information is about causes of some of the chronic diseases like cancer, as well as around nutrition. And so I wanted to give this example just to highlight how kind of extreme this issue tends to be. These are two headlines from two press releases that came out on the same exact day about the same study. The one on the top was from the university from where the researchers were who did the study. And the one on the bottom is from the medical journal JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, one of the top journals in the country, that published the study. So both press releases from different sources. The top one obviously says new study suggests that vitamin D decreases risk of cancer. The bottom one says vitamin D among older women does not significantly reduce the risk of cancer. These really were real press releases, same day, same study. Obviously, they say the opposite thing. They're not both true. And this is something that we face all the time. There are a lot of reasons why this happens. The bottom one happens to be really the right headline. The top one, how did they get it wrong? There are a number of reasons, one of which is that one of the lead scientists on the study actually told the university press office that this was, quote, the most important study of the century to date, even though the findings were actually negative. And so a lot of what we see, there's some really faulty incentives in the area around how scientists get their funding, and they're trying to promote their own work, and then the university wants to promote the scientists. And all of this comes together. So one person writes the press release, somebody else writes the headline. There are a lot of issues in how scientific information gets communicated, and it causes a lot of problems. Now, the issue is that when we're faced with conflicting information as human beings, we don't tend to keep our minds open. We like to have certainty and make up our minds, and often what we do is grab onto whatever information confirms what we want to believe for one reason or another, and then we just go with that, and it's very hard for us to then change our minds. So this motivated reasoning can come from a few places, and there's two major concepts that I wanted to touch on today. One is called confirmation bias, and one is called the backfire effect. Confirmation bias, you've probably heard a lot more about more recently. It's basically the idea that people will seek out and also attend more closely to information that confirms what they already believe. So they have a kind of built-in filter to only look at things that they want to believe or already believe. And the backfire effect, I'm going to give you an example of in a minute because it's quite interesting and a little bit disturbing. But it kind of takes the form of this comic says, why would my unvaccinated kids be a threat to your vaccinated kids if you're so sure that vaccines work? This is an example of, we've probably all been in this situation on both sides of the conversation, where the more you tell somebody facts, the more they come back with resistance that becomes stronger and stronger to those facts. And no matter how much information you throw at them, they come back stronger and stronger with an opinion that is misinformed. And so why does this happen? And what are the barriers to convincing people about the facts? Now, I'm obviously in the field of public health. I think I'm surrounded by many political scientists. So actually this study that was very important in my field and in this sort of smaller field of science denial in the public health field, this study was actually done by a political scientist at Dartmouth named Brendan Nyhan in 2014, and it was published in the journal Pediatrics. And he wanted to look at what would happen if we communicate with people about the safety of vaccines in a couple of different ways. And he was trying to address this issue that some people continue to believe that vaccines cause autism because of a paper that came out in 1998 that was subsequently retracted. And the person who did the study also lost his medical license because there was fraud in the study. So it was a completely debunked study, but there's been this persistence of this belief, and people refused to vaccinate their children against measles, especially measles, mumps, and rubella. And then we see outbreaks, especially of measles. And what he wanted to know really was, how do giving people facts change their mind, if at all, and their intentions to vaccinate? And then how do scaring people about the measles change their intention to vaccinate and their minds? So he had 4 conditions, and this was a very rigorously done study that was random assignment, and there were about 1,800 people in it. So the 4 conditions were, in the first one, they gave people information explaining just the lack of evidence that the vaccine, called the MMR vaccine, causes autism. So they gave them the facts. That's a very traditional approach to this kind of issue in the public health field. Then there was another condition where they gave people information about the dangers of the diseases prevented by the vaccine. So basically, mostly measles. They would talk about what are these diseases and explain that they really are very dangerous and that they can cause children to die in some severe cases. And then they had 2 fear-based conditions. So one was images of children who have measles, and another one was a dramatic narrative about an infant who almost died of measles. And so they were trying to appeal to the emotional side and said, look, we see a lot of people coming from the anti-vaccine side who tend to scare people into not getting the vaccine. So what if we scare people the other way about what's going to happen if they don't get the vaccine, right? They'll come back and they'll get the vaccine. Well, not exactly. What happened was, kind of as expected, the information on its own not only didn't work, but it actually decreased the intent to vaccinate among parents who came in with the least favorable attitudes to begin with. And then the images and the dramatic narrative actually, again, increased the belief in both the vaccine autism link and also decreased the intention to vaccinate. And so everybody was kind of upset about this in my field, because we said, well, wait a second, information doesn't work, scaring people doesn't work. Not only does none of this work, but it might make the situation even worse. What is going on? And this is where we can see actually the backfire effect in full force. The backfire effect being you give people more and more information, or you try to scare them in this case, and they come back with incredibly even more and more increased belief in something that is incorrect. So then we try to get into, okay, why does this happen? And what is going on in the brain? So there is some neuroscience also in my book, and so I wanted to just touch on this briefly because there's some interesting studies that are done about what is happening in the brain when people persist in these beliefs and don't change their minds. And so this particular study was done with for about 40 subjects who were self-proclaimed liberals. So they came in saying they had very strong liberal beliefs, and they were on that side of the political spectrum. And what they did in this study was they took a number of beliefs that participants had said that they agreed with strongly, and they split people into political beliefs and non-political beliefs. So some people in the political belief were in the political belief setting, and some people were in the non-political belief condition. And the political belief would be something like abortion should be legal, and the non-political belief was usually something historical, like Thomas Edison invented the light bulb. And what they did was they put people, they looked at they scanned their brains during this, but they basically gave them the statement that they said they agreed with strongly. Then they gave them a counter argument, and then they gave them the statement again. And they measured whether the person changed their mind before and after by doing a survey, how do you still believe this? And they also looked at the activity in the brain. And they found a couple of things. One thing across the board was that people in the political condition, none of them changed their minds. So no matter how much factual information they were given to the contrary of the political belief, they did not budge. And then on the non-political side, more people changed their minds. So if they heard some compelling facts that Thomas Edison didn't invent the light bulb, then they changed their mind about that. The other thing that happened, though, some of the more interesting things that were actually going on in the brain. So they found that, in general, when people were faced with, in the political condition, when they were faced with these counter-arguments, the parts of the brain that were really activated were not the parts of the brain, the frontal part of the brain that's responsible for reasoning and really listening and processing the argument. The parts of the brain that were activated instead were actually parts of the brain that are about identity, thinking about yourself, your identity, who you are, and also scanning the memory for ways to counter the counter argument. So in other words, people not only didn't really hear or process the counter argument that they were getting, but they actually would spend the entire time mounting some kind of comeback. And so their brains were really occupied in that, and that kind of shows you how the belief becomes so much stronger when you're faced with a counter argument like we saw in the Nyhan study. The other thing that happened was that with people in the non-political setting, they looked at individual differences and who changed their mind and who didn't. They couldn't do that in the political setting because, as I said, nobody changed their mind. So they looked at the non-political condition, and there were some individual differences. And they said, well, what's the difference in the brain activity? And the people who didn't change their minds had higher activation of some of the parts of the brain that are responsible for emotion, the amygdala and the insular cortex. And so they were really suppressing the frontal portion, again, of their brain that was the more reasoning aspect. So all of this is just to say that we can actually see going on in the brain. There are a couple of things that happen when you're faced with a counter argument. If you're very connected, if you're very attached to a belief in an emotional way, then you won't process it in your frontal cortex. You'll have an emotional response. And you'll also be very focused on thinking about mounting a counter argument and looking inward and reflecting on your identity. And all of that will become so much stronger, and you won't be able to actually process the information that you're getting. And so that's part of why you don't change your mind. Now, I said at the beginning that there was this thing called motivated reasoning or motivated thinking, and you really see this coming very clear in this study because the political beliefs are a very kind of motivated belief because you want to believe your political beliefs. They're a big part of your identity, and they're very important to most people. On the other hand, the non-political beliefs, you may have less motivation to maintain those beliefs because maybe you don't really care whether or not Thomas Edison invented the light bulb, but you do really care that abortion should be legal. So at this point in my talks, people tend to get really depressed because I've been talking for a little while about all the problems with our brains and how we can't change our minds. So I do try to add in a bit about what can we do about this, because this is really actually the focus of my work. And there's a lot of research on this. There's a lot of different actually things that do work. Obviously not giving people more information or necessarily scaring them, but there are ways to do this, and I'll just give you a taste of a few. And so in the vaccine setting, in the anti-vaccine movement, one thing that people often get upset about is they say, what are we going to do? All these people won't get their children vaccinated, and they don't trust the doctor. So there's really no inroad. And actually, that's not exactly true. Doctors are still tend to be a very trusted part of society, and most people who go in with their children and talk to the pediatrician or another healthcare provider about vaccinating their children, if they end up, if they're nervous about it, but they end up deciding to vaccinate, the most important thing that help them make that decision is usually the physician's advice. But the issue is that there has to be a trusted relationship, and often you have to spend time really talking through some of the hesitancy and some of the issues, and we all know in the healthcare system we have today, there often isn't time to do that, and that kind of activity is not usually reimbursed. But there is the ability to have that conversation. The other thing that's very interesting is sort of around social influence and looking at communities of people who maybe hold certain beliefs that are not scientific, but try to think about who are the influencers in those communities and how can they spread a more scientific or fact-based message. And we saw this recently. There was a measles outbreak recently in Minnesota in the Somali American community. And there were doubts about vaccines. There were fears that the vaccines were causing autism actually since 2008. But there was just an outbreak this year. And for a while, public health officials were kind of doing our usual thing of going in there and giving them the information, and that wasn't working so well. And then they said, why don't we work with the imams in this community and see if they'll adopt our message and really encourage people to get vaccinated. And that actually worked very well. And in general, one of the things that does work is thinking about who is the messenger. And if that messenger is very influential in the community you're in, that can make a big difference. And then there are a couple of more what I would call structural approaches to these issues. So a lot of what I normally talk about is kind of individual one-on-one based solutions to these problems, but there are some things that can happen at sort of a higher level. And some of these things include, at least in healthcare systems, social benchmarking approaches. So for instance, in the world of the hospital, where if people are overprescribing antibiotics, one of the things that works really well is to show people very high prescribing physicians, to show them that they're an outlier, and actually the rest of the pack is over here and you're over here. That actually ends up bringing people, they want to be doing what everyone else is doing. So that's one thing that does work very well. Social modeling and influence approaches, I just spoke about that. That's a very important, I think, underutilized type of strategy. Publicizing practice-based policies, making it very clear to people that, for instance, in the antibiotic example, this practice does not allow or does not endorse prescription of antibiotics for viral conditions. That results in people asking for less antibiotics and doctors being more comfortable saying no. Reimbursement, like I just said, for evidence-based counseling approaches, I think I covered that, but what happens is that doctors don't have time and they don't get paid to do that kind of work, but it's very, very important. And then, of course, serious funding of serious research on improving public trust in science. This is an urgent issue that has real consequences for everyone's health and safety, and it should be prioritized. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for these presentations. I'm sure we all learned a great deal. I know I certainly did. So the floor is now open for questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and one of the ushers will bring a wireless mic for you to ask your questions, because we are taping this, so we want to make sure that your question makes it into the audio recording. You can also tweet your questions using the hashtag BYO Truth, and someone is monitoring that, so we will be able to pick up on those questions. So, any questions from the audience? Yeah, we have a question in the front here.
Is this on?
Yeah.
Hi. I had a question for the second speaker. As individuals, how can we build rapport and trusts in our conversations using the neuroscience? How can we build that trust so that we can help have a likelihood of either of us actually having our minds changed?
Great, thanks. Can you hear me?
Maybe closer.
Can you hear me? Was it on? This thing?
Go up to the mic.
Do you want mine?
No. Oh. I can go up there.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, thanks for that question. That's a great question. I think one of the things you have to do first is try to understand where on the spectrum of disbelief the person you're talking to is, because one of the things that happens is that sometimes when people are really entrenched in their views, it can be very, very difficult, unless you're a skilled professional at some of these counseling techniques I talked about, to move them over to the other side. So one thing you want to do is to try to understand where they are. That's just helpful for you to not get yelled at. But I think one of the after that, if you're sensing that somebody is sort of maybe not all the way over there, they're kind of more hesitant, and but they have some misperceptions. our tendency is to want to go back with all of the facts and just to say you're wrong because this study, that study, the other study. And like I showed you, that's our knee jerk, but it's really not the right way to approach these issues. So what I really recommend is actually starting with some very open questions and helping the person trace how they actually came to believe what they believe. It helps them slow down and reprocess where they are in this journey to that decision and that belief. And help them understand that by saying, that's interesting, why do you think that? What would make you, what kind of evidence do you tend to believe? And so to understand what sources that they look at. The other thing is to help them uncover, because everybody has ambivalence on some level, even when they seem really strong about their view. And so when you start to uncover with them and ask them more questions and say, is there anything about this idea or this decision that actually bothers you, you often unearth a bit of that ambivalence, and then people become more able to admit that they might be able to change their minds. So that's formally called a motivational interviewing kind of technique. If you Google it, you'll find information about it, but it's a very helpful way to structure conversations about some of these really divisive issues.
Thank you.
Another question? I'm sorry. Yes, right here. Sorry.
Hi, good morning. My question is for Professor Zentella. Regarding what Dr. Gorman just mentioned about how difficult it is to change someone's opinion about, say, Spanish as a language of the ghetto. We can't talk about like, oh, look at the beautiful works of literature that were written in Spanish and in Latin America too. So, and because they just won't believe us. So how do we combat their views about saying that Spanish is some ghetto language?
Yes, I was also going to ask her that question because of the interesting impact in looking at the brain scans and how identity is involved in that. And it seems to me that one of the things that we need to look at is the larger context in the United States of what the identity, the favored identity is. The racial identity, the class identity, the educational identity, and the linguistic identity. And that once you understand what those iconic figures are, how it's whiteness and upper middle classness and English that are the icons of this identity, you understand the extraordinary struggle that you're going to be in about these issues. I was lecturing at the University of Alabama, and in a large audience, larger than this, somebody raised her hand and said, what do I tell my uncles and aunts and my parents when they're talking about Spanish and how it's ruining the United States and how these people are ruining the United States? And I was so grateful for that question, but more grateful for the answer that came from another student that said, what I do and what I would suggest in these interactions is to say, in addition to how did you come to that idea, to speak to, in my experience, it's somewhat different. I know people who no longer have children who can speak to their grandparents. I know of people who are reading and writing in Spanish and in English very well at high levels. I know the man who is cleaning our offices, who is working 2 jobs and then going to a night class to learn English. That those things, and everybody in the audience was like, yeah, I can do that. I can do that. I can reach out, and if I don't have those personal experiences, I need to reach out to that person who is cleaning our offices or our dorms and find out more about them and their backgrounds. Do you think that helps? De nada.
Any other question? Yeah, a question in the back there.
My question's to the first speaker. The mic is on.
Yeah, I can hear you.
My question is to the first speaker. How do you think the increase in English as a official language is going to affect language majors, whether it's Spanish or French or Arabic? How's that going to affect like job markets and everything?
Well, I think that the global market is really going to affect the job market in language teaching and exposure, because the corporate world pays a great deal of attention to the world's languages. Unfortunately, English is swallowing up many languages around the world, and that is a whole other talk. In other words, what happens to an entire community when their language and the structures and ways in which they think are being eradicated and lost over the generations. But globally, people are more and more interested in learning other languages. Anytime you go to Africa or to Asia, people speak 2, 3 languages. The educated person is not expected to be monolingual. This in the United States is an anomaly. Less than 10% of the universities in the United States require a foreign language for graduation. That's unheard of in most other countries, where you learn other languages as part of your education as you grow up. So I think that we need to reach out to more of these languages. We need to to make sure that the children in our communities are being raised bilingually. You can go to just send me an email and I'll send you a little booklet on how to raise a bilingual child. Because when people tell me they're going to raise a bilingual child, I say, bring me this child when they're 5, and if they know more than the words for milk and juice, I will congratulate you, because it's very difficult in the United States to raise a bilingual child. I have seen people told speak English only in Walmart. You know, when they're walking along talking to their child and somebody else comes to them and say, you should be raising that child in English only. So you have all those attitudes to deal with. But I think it's going to be very important for all of us. Let me just get a show of hands. How many of you here know a language other than English enough to do more than order a drink? Okay, so this is very unusual. I asked that question in the UC system and University of California, and the numbers are much, much lower. So I congratulate you on that, and I urge you to reach out to make sure that your children and the children in your family are becoming bilingual.
Okay. Question in the back. Okay, perfect.
This question's for the first speaker. Coming from Hispanic origins, my parents are Dominican. I've noticed that many Spanish cultures are very prideful in their individualism as a country or native tongue. How do we kind of combat that first before taking on the task of combating or making the fact that English is, or like speaking Spanish as a whole is more acceptable? But how do we make it more acceptable within the Spanish community, acceptable for all cultures together, kind of to integrate that?
I think you're talking about the fact that most people don't like Dominican Spanish or Puerto Rican Spanish, and you know what those issues are.
Yes.
They're race and class issues,
Yes.
above all. Because the varieties of Spanish spoken in Puerto Rico and La República come from the section of Spain known as Andalusia, where they also drop S's and do things that we do in Caribbean Spanish. But there it's cool. And in New York, I have a whole study of 150 Latinos in New York and how they think that Colombian Spanish is greater, and even Cuban Spanish with the same features is greater. And these are race and class issues at the root. The Dominican Republic is the home to the first university in the Americas, in the Western world. It's the home to a great deal of knowledge about Spanish and the origin of the Spanish language. And it's the birthplace, not the burial place of the Spanish language. So when we understand that, and we have pride in our own, but we understand the variety, people are telling, everybody speaks from where they're from. I don't care if you're an English monolingual, you have ways of saying certain words that come from your neighborhood or your part of the country. And those are your identifiers. They're not to be dismissed as junk. They are to be, Nikki Giovanni told us, the school teaches you to hate your mama because it teaches you that the way that she talked is inferior. And in fact, we need to be proud of those ways that we brought from our homes, and we also need to expand them. I need to be able to talk here in this academic environment. I also need to be able to lecture in Puerto Rico and in Mexico and in Spain, as I have done, in varieties of Spanish that they understand and can communicate with. So I think we're going to need to help people understand that this variety is part of the richness of all of our linguistic backgrounds, and that the linguistic variety is an exemplar of the different racial and cultural and religious varieties that also exist and need to be embraced.
Thank you.
We have a question here in the front, second row right here.
Hello, it's for Anna. I know by experience that it's very difficult to teach your child to be bilingual because I come from a Hispanic family. My brother's 2 years older than me, and he was taught to be bilingual at a young age, so he was taught Spanish so that by the time he went to school, he would learn English. So he was raised by my grandma, who was Spanish speaking, so he learned Spanish perfect. By the time he got to pre-K, they had told my mom that it was unacceptable. Him being born in the US couldn't speak English. So in essence, she put my brother in ESL and didn't allow my grandma to come to the graduation because she brought him back.
Yeah.
Since I was 2, they kind of took me away from my grandma. I was only taught English.
Yeah.
And that's because it was my mom's decision. It's going to be difficult for you to go into school speaking Spanish. We could speak Spanish and learn English in school and come back home and speak Spanish. I went into school speaking English, but since my brother's reputation of going into school speaking Spanish, they put me in ESL classes already speaking English. I learned Spanish in school. And it's very unfortunate that today my brother has difficulty speaking Spanish, and I'm actually more fluent than him. But it's unfortunate that a lot of teachers speak to parents that it's a sin to teach your child another language when it's actually, you're putting your child in a new realm of being able to speak to someone else from a different language in a different country.
I can't thank you enough for this painful example. It speaks volumes more than what I can speak. And these are the examples that other people are going to be able to take when they need to answer these questions. But I just want to say this relating to Sara's points here. The fact that teachers are using as information this notion that you're confusing the child by raising them in 2 languages, that it is going to be cognitively impairing for them to function in 2 languages at the same time. We now have lots of scientific data that prove that the opposite is true. Not only do your brains develop more ability to make analogies and to see other points of view and to compare things as a result of having been raised with 2 different types of language structures. It's also true that in old age, I'm going to take 4 years longer to become demented than some of the monolingual friends I have, okay? So the advantages in old age of bilingualism have also been very documented. But a lot of educators are still is pumping out this idea that it is cognitively impairing. That fulfills the narrative of English is the only language that really matters, that you really need, that the well-educated child really needs. And that is the real outside context that promotes this incorrect information. But your example is very painful and accurately captures what goes on in many, many families. Fortunately, we have bilingual education on the rise again. California just passed it. New Jersey now has a certificate that you can get in a high school as you graduate from high school if you, in any language, are able to, in two languages, show that you have some dexterity. So it's our task to struggle against that, to encourage bilingual education, and to encourage parents and to tell them, no, you're not harming your child. I have parents who said, mi hijo el americanito solo habla inglés, with tremendous pride, you know, not understanding that that, in fact, is going to contribute to problems later on. We know from Vietnamese studies in New Orleans that young Vietnamese who lose the language are more prone to be involved in gangs, that people who have lost languages have less connection to families and cultures, and therefore to the nurturing that will keep them, you know, protected from some of the other encounters that they're going to face as immigrants.
Okay, so that's the time for this session. So please join me in thanking Dr. Zentella and Dr. Gorman for coming here today. Thank you so much. And so to the audience, thank you for coming here today. It's always great when we bring in speakers and so many of you come here to listen to what they have to learn. In about 15 minutes, we're going to have our keynote address, so we hope that some of you can stay for this. We have the keynote address by Dr. Stephen Sloman, who will talk about ignorance and the community of knowledge. And we're also going to have a session this afternoon on circulating truth and misinformation. So thank you again for coming here this morning.